And I know even, for example, Dan's homesick today, and other people are sick. Fred and Mona I talked to, and they're in quarantine, and so you have people that are that can't be here, as well as people that are still doing everything online, and we have some that are more hesitant to drive in the wintertime at night, and so we hope that we can make this as available to as many as possible. So we're set? Okay, good. Well, if you are joining us online, we're glad that you're able to join us. And that's not supposed to happen. But we're glad you're able to join us. I'm glad we're able to do this. Again, one of the goals with this is to be able to offer a class that is something that is, I think, very relevant, very practical, but then also to do what we can to make it as accessible as to many people as possible. And so we're glad for those that are able to be here. We're glad for those that are joining us online as well. One thing that we want to say from the onset is that the goal of this is to be more of an interactive time. And so it's, obviously I'm going to do a lot of speaking and lecturing. I've prepared a lot of notes. But beyond that, we really want to make it something that we have time that we can interact, that we can, we give you a chance to be able to ask questions, to make comments. Now, there's going to be a couple pieces with that are really significant. For those that are here in person, if you have a question or comment that's really short that I can repeat, you can do that. If you have something that's longer, a longer question or a longer comment, we're going to ask you to come up and use one of the microphones. And the main reason is so that people who are online can hear you. And if we don't do that, it's, you might make this really great comment, but nobody actually hears what you say. And that makes it probably a little less effective if nobody hears what you say. So we're going to ask you to do that. For those that are that are online, that are watching from home, we also want you to interact. And what you see, I think there's a note that's on the bottom of the screen as far as texting questions. And so if you have any comments, any questions, we're going to ask you to just go ahead and text that in. And you just text it to the church number, 330-644-6121. And if you just text those in, Danny's going to take those and send them back to me. And so it gives us a chance for us to be able to make it an interactive time, to give you a chance to be able to ask questions, to make comments. And we hope that you're able to do that. Also, I will say that for those that are here, for those that are note keepers, it was funny, we were talking, even just a few people coming in. I'm a note keeper. That's my nature. It's being ADD. If I'm not taking notes, my mind wanders and I have no idea. The only way for me to keep my mind focused is actually write things. And so I know there are some people that's helpful. So we have some notes that are available. If you didn't pick one up, there's some notebooks at the door. We invite you to take that and use it. For those that are at home, those notes are also available. So if you I think there's a link there, and we have two things that should be available for tonight. We should have kind of like the introduction and syllabus, kind of like the class description, what we're going to do, and then the first week's notes. And so you can, open those up, and whether you print them off at home or whether you just, use them and take notes, on your phone or your iPad or whatever, please feel free to do that. But we want to make all this available for as much as we can. And some of, again, in whatever works or doesn't work, please give us interaction. We are, this isn't a, kind of, we're trying new things. We're kind of stepping into new ground. And so we will hopefully be more effective at doing this well, several weeks from now than we are tonight. I hope it goes well tonight. But we're still learning. So any feedback that you'll have, we're very appreciative of that. So let me open in a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, I thank you for the privilege that we do have to spend this time this evening. I thank you for the truth that you give us, Father, that you give us a faith that is rooted in truth. Father, that you called us to be people that search that truth out, that, Father, that we can have a faith that we're confident in that it's not just true because we believe it, but, Father, that it's true. And Father, even as we interact with people who may disagree, that are maybe even object, Father, that you give us the opportunity not only to not be intimidated by those objections, but Father, to really interact and to know that ultimately we have the truth. Father, I pray that you give us wisdom not only of what to say, but also how to say it. Father, that you give wisdom in understanding how to represent you well. And in our discussions and our interactions, not only with skeptics, but with family and with friends and with neighbors and coworkers. Father, I pray your blessing now in our time, our discussion, our thoughts. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, let me start by looking a little bit at kind of where we're going to be going. And so for those that are here, you have got that first kind of 3 pages, kind of more of an outline. And so, just more of an introduction. It's really just this whole idea that, I don't know about you, but I've talked to people all the time where we kind of have this idea that we kind of get intimidated. We feel like if, that we start talking to someone and if they object, we just don't know how to answer. And I talk to Christians that, that not only feel intimidated, some will actually kind of avoid a discussion because they kind of assume that we're on the losing, the losing side of the battle. And that's very unfortunate. I think it's something that, that for starters, I'd say, you might have somebody that has studied something more than some Christians have, and they might present more confidence, but the fact is that there's, truth is on our side, and we're going to see that as we go. And we need to figure out, okay, how do we do this? Number one, how do we have confidence in our own faith so that we're not intimidated, we don't feel like, that we're worried about our faith being, blown out of the water by having a discussion. And not only that, how do we do it in a way that also then can interact with skeptics and not argue with them, but interact with them in such a way that really helps guide them toward the truth. And I think right there in the beginning we talk about how Colossians 4, 5, and 6 says that we should walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of our time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And I love the New Living Translation of that. They say in verse 6, they say, let your conversation be gracious and attractive, that you'll have a right response for every person. And we're going to talk about that a lot tonight, this idea of truth and grace. And it's not only that we have the right answers, but that we say the right answers in the right way. And so the goal is really to help you become more confident in your faith. Not only to stand strong, to not be intimidated, but to even to be able to interact with people, and to not only be able to give the truth, but ideally give the truth in a way that is winsome. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to do, this will be kind of a little different discussion. A lot of classes like this, when you talk about answering skeptics, what they tend to do is they tend to focus on one issue and go really, really deep. And so they might be, okay, how do we know the history of the faith, or how do we know creation, evolution, or how do we know, the truth of Jesus' resurrection, and there's a lot of books, there's a lot of things like that will really take one thing, philosophical apologetics, or what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time kind of, instead of going really deep on one thing, we're going to kind of go more broad, and we're going to look at a lot of different issues. Some that have studied more apologetics, there may be things that you've dove into before. Some things we're going to probably deal with that are a little unusual, because it's really saying, what are the objections of skeptics? How do we interact with? I'll tell you, a few of these we're going to take a different approach on. I will also say that what we're going to do is pretty much every week I'm going to be recommending other resources as well. And so it's going to be, if you want to go deeper, here's a good book. If you want to go deeper, here's a good video series. A lot of weeks, and this is actually on that last page of the notes there. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to be video series, and something we want you to know about is that we as a church have a church membership of something called Right Now Media. I don't know if all of you know that, or if you have that membership for that. But we have a church membership, and what that means is everyone associated with the church, we give you access to it. And so it's this huge video library. It's basically, people talk about it, the Netflix of Bible studies, and that's basically kind of what it is. Huge library with thousands of Bible studies, and what we're going to do is many weeks I'm going to even say, if you want to go deeper, here's a good video series, and Right Now Media. Now, some of you may have already be aware of that. Because a few times we'll say, if you want to sign up, let us know, and we'll help you sign up. If you if you have that, I would encourage you to use it. If you do not have Right Now Media, there's some information there in like the third page of the little notes. We would like you to join that. All we want you to do is to email the church office. If you just didn't email Jamie at info@ccpl.life, and email and ask her for an invitation for Right Now Media. And she'll email you something back. It will be from Right Now Media, and it will be just a link to be able to join that membership. And so it will be a link, you click on it, and it's real easy. Just fill your name, email address, and that's pretty much it. And then you're in. It's all paid for. We have that church membership. And so there's going to be things that we'll recommend, almost every week. And again, I'd tell you, there's some great things that are going to take you deeper in the subjects we're looking at. But the whole Right Now Media library is tremendous. You'll find all kinds of stuff in there that beyond even what, just on these issues that we're looking at today. So we're going to mention that. I'll tell you even right off the bat, if you look at this week, we're going to talk about some of the ideas, not only, as religions of, the importance of knowing the truth and kind of some of the sample objections that you hear. People say, well, religion is a matter of faith, while science is a matter of truth. Or, faith in a religion is like believing in a myth, like Santa Claus. And so there's other questions like that. I'll tell you, like this week, a great resource that I'm going to be, kind of some of the things that I'm referencing. There's a book called Tactics. And in fact, I meant to grab it out of my office. I could tell you, it's like Kunkel is his last name. I forget how you spell it. But it's a really, really good book. And it's not necessarily, it's talking about how to defend our faith, but it's a lot more on how to do it. It's not just the content, but how do we engage people in a winsome manner. And so it's a really great book that I'd recommend for what we're going to talk about this week. So let me give an outline. That's the idea for this week. Next week, we're going to be looking at the key concept. There's the idea that people will say that there's no distinction between religious, or people say there's a distinction between religious truth and other truth, and there isn't. And so it's really more responding to postmodern thinking and things about, people say there's no such thing as absolute truth, or we can't know the truth, or Christians are arrogant saying that they know the truth. So that's next week. The following week, we're going to break for Super Bowl Sunday, which I was even kind of thinking. People asked me, they said, well, if you're scheduled to start this week, what if the Browns are in the championship game and, will you start when they're playing? And I said, oh, that's not unlikely to happen. And it almost happened. So the impossible they could have been in the Super Bowl. The 14th, we're looking more at reasons to believe in the uniqueness of the Bible on February 14th. The February 21st, more the evidence for Jesus' life and his ministry and his resurrection. And February 28th, evidence for creation versus evolution. And we're going to spend a little bit more time in that March 7th, and then we're going to also spend time talking about good and evil in God. How could a good God allow evil? And those questions. In March 14th, we're going to talk about, aren't all religions basically the same? And talking about not only that idea, but then also cults and what sets us apart. March 21st, we're going to talk about, people that will argue that Christians are judgmental and loving, and I don't like to be around Christians. And then on the last week, I'm going to tell you, March 28th, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about contemporary morality and the challenges that we have there. Questions like, we expect you to come and celebrate our homosexual marriage. Or, what you say when your niece tells you that they're now a nephew, that type of thing. And how do we respond in a Christian way? That also is going to be a week where it's just open question and answer. And so, as we go through this, if there's anything that we, think about that you'd like to talk about, that, that we don't get to, please write it down because we'll spend time for that week. So, and again, we're really hoping that this will be interactive, that you will, again, in person or online, that you'll interact, that you'll, get to join us with us. So that's kind of a real brief overview. I'm looking forward to it. I've been doing a lot of work in preparation. I think that it's going to be hopefully really beneficial, I hope enjoyable for those that are here in person as well as online. So any questions or comments before we jump into this week? Nope, you all with me and nobody's online? Nobody's asking, texting? All right, so this week, it's about the importance of knowing the truth. and some of the kind of questions that we have. Up in the top there, you'll kind of see some of the questions that we're kind of going to try to deal with. People would say that religion is a matter of faith, while science is a matter of truth. Faith in a religion is like believing in a myth or a legend. It's like believing in Santa Claus. Some people say, Christians are argumentative. And some people argue, in my experience, Christians don't care about me, they're just looking for converts. And those are things that I've heard, and many of you have heard, and those are some of the questions that we want to try to interact with today. So if we look at it, and again, it's, if you have notes, I'm going to kind of go through this and, tell you where to fill in the notes so that we can do that if you want to keep the notes. We're going to start, the first point is God calls us to engage people with truth and grace. And this is really important for us to remember. A lot of times, we do really well at one or the other of those. So I know, there's a lot of churches that they're very gracious and very loving and very, but they seldom speak any truth. And there's a lot of churches that will tell you the truth, but they aren't very gracious. And God calls us to interact with truth and grace. Look at a couple key passages that I think are kind of going to be foundational passages for this whole time together. 1 Peter 3, it says, even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. So don't worry or be afraid of their threats. Instead, you must worship Christ Jesus as Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way. And I love that. Be ready to give this hope. But we do it with gentleness and respectful. Colossians, we saw a moment ago, live wisely amongst those who are not believers and make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive, that you'll have the right response for everyone. And so, we're, on the one hand, what we're going to be talking about, a lot of what is called apologetics. And apologetics is something we talk about. They say it's making an apology for our faith. It's not apologizing like it's wrong. It's making a defense. It's making a statement for. And in apologetics, there's in a sense two sides of this challenge. On the one hand, some people will call defensive apologetics, and that's this idea that it's answering objections and questions. And so, we have skeptics that are opposed to the faith. And what about this? What about this? And so how do we answer that? The other side is sometimes called offensive apologetics, and that's more of a question of going on the offense and saying, okay, how do we move forward? How do we make this argument for our faith, for the truthfulness? We're not only trying to prove that it's not false, we're trying to demonstrate that it's true. And now, it might sound from the title of the class, Answering the Objections of Skeptics, that we're primarily focusing on the defensive. And we're going to start there most weeks. We're going to start by saying, okay, these are some of the questions and the objections. But I think every week we also want to go back and say it's not only that we're not false, but we're true. And it's important to be able to demonstrate the truthfulness of our faith. But there's also another side of the challenge. And that is, when we think about this, it's not just about making a statement, defense of our faith, or an argument for the truth, but it's also about recognizing that our goal isn't just to win an argument. We need to remember that Christianity is a faith of the head and the heart. It's a faith of the head in that it deals with truth. But it's not just a faith of the mind. It's not just mental. It's also a faith of the heart. And we need to engage people in such a way that speaks to their mind, but at the same time speaks to the heart. And that's vital for us to recognize. At the next point there in the notes is, remember, the real issue is the heart. We've got to realize that as Christians, we can have all the right answers. And the fact is that somebody could have all the right answers and they aren't necessarily a believer. And people have talked about this, that I've never argued someone into the faith. And that's true, that you love people into the faith. But there's, in the love, in the relationship, the fact is that it also has to involve truth too. Again, you've got to realize that, okay, how do I believe with my heart? Well, I've got to believe in the truth. I've got to have the truth. But by itself, the truth isn't there. In fact, you think about James chapter 2, and James talks about faith and works and the importance of how his argument is, James 2:14, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? And basically saying, he's not saying different than Paul, saying it's, well, you got to have faith plus what you do. What he's saying, the true nature of true faith is one that results in a changed life. And so then he says in verse 19, you believe that there's one God, good. You do well. Even the demons believe that and shudder. And so they're saying if it was just an intellectual belief, it was just having the right thoughts, hey, Satan's got great theology. Satan knows that Jesus Christ is God. He knows that he died on the cross. I mean, he knows all those things. He has great theology. But the fact of the matter is that his heart is opposed to God. And the right thoughts don't necessarily mean that, that you're a follower of Christ. So the question is, what is faith then? Well, faith is not only thinking something, but then putting my trust in that. In a sense, another way of saying it is, it's not only do I believe something, but I act as if it's true. And we know this in many, many areas. So let's take, for example, I think on a lot of health areas, we can joke about this, but it's, my doctors told me that I would be a little healthier if I lost a few pounds. Do I believe him? That's a good question. Because intellectually, do I agree with him? I understand that. But the fact is that if I really believed him, then my actions would probably change so that's what you would see happen. It's interesting, and many of you have seen this. I've got somebody that was, that I know real well within our family, who had always been, kind of on the, not major overweight, but he is definitely on the overweight side. And then he had a major heart attack. And suddenly, his doctor says, your health is at major risk. And so he's got this major heart attack, and suddenly what the doctors had been telling him for many years became real. And so he went from agreeing to believing. And so his lifestyle changed, and suddenly he's eating differently, he's exercising, because he believes it. Right now I kind of think it, but I'm not sure I really believe it. And when you realize that, there's a difference between, when we use the word belief, we often think of it as being primarily intellectual. But it's something that goes beyond intellect. It really goes to trust. It goes to action. It's if I really believe something, then I'm going to do it. I'm going to act on that. Now, is the intellect important? Yeah. Because you can't believe with your heart something that you don't think is true in your mind. So the fact of the matter is, let's say, for example, there's a doctor that comes and, they've got all these, and I'm not picking on any of these diets right now, but, let's say there's this doctor that comes out and let's say he's got this diet that, that if it's the fruit diet, if all you eat is fruit all day long, you're going to get all this healthy and you're going to do this and you heal. Now, that doctor could be a great salesman and he could really convince me emotionally, but if I think he's a quack, he might really convince the emotions of the heart in a sense, but if I don't think it's true, I'm never going to believe it. And that's what we have to realize, that when we talk about this whole issue of faith, and as we're interacting with skeptics, it is something that is heart and mind, and we've got to engage the heart, but at the same point in time, we've got to engage the mind. And if all we do is intellectual arguments, then we might convince the mind, but we're not going to deal with the heart. There's not going to be a true conviction. But on the other hand, if all we do is the heart, and we don't ever, if we just love the person and we never actually answer the arguments, if you're convinced that something is wrong, you're never going to put your trust in something that you think is false. And so there's a really important aspect to understanding both of these ideas. And let me ask you again, Danny, I want to ask you if there's any texts that come in. Let me know, because I just want to make sure that they show up on me. Again, please feel free to interact or questions or comments as we go. So, keep going? Okay. what I'll tell you is that while there is a intellectual heart and mind thing, in my experience, I would say the majority of people that have intellectual arguments against God are primarily dealing with an intellectual argument that's a cover for rejecting God, for a cover for a heart issue. So in the notes, for most intellectual arguments are cover for rejecting God. There's a guy that I know that talks about this. He's a pastor up in actually now in New York City, and he talks about how for years he would have young people in his church that would go away to college and they'd come back and they'd be like, oh, I went to this class and I had this atheist and talked about evolution and I'm questioning Christianity. And he said that he interacted with these students, pretty much, every year and would try to talk with them. And then as he got to know them and as he got to know their stories and he got to see their, kind of what was happening in their life, he says, what would happen is when these freshmen would go off and they'd come back and they'd say they're questioning God, I'd meet with them, but my first question became the same every time. My first question was, so when did you start sleeping with your girlfriend, or your boyfriend? And basically what he found out is that he said, what would happen is that most of these students made moral choices that rejected biblical morality. And then they found intellectual cover to basically make them feel better about rejecting God morally. And he said, in my experience, he said, I couldn't think of any students that didn't go that path, that didn't reject God morally first, that didn't reject God's authority in their life, where they started just by rejecting God intellectually. And pretty much every time that would happen. And so we've got to realize that while there is an intellectual aspect, we're also going to be dealing with the fact that a lot of times the intellectual aspect is kind of cover for rejecting God. And that's why, and many of you, if you've had discussions with some skeptics, what you'll find is that they'll say, I've always wondered this. I can't believe because of this. And so then you spend time and you answer that question, and it's not like, well, maybe there's some truth to that. It's like, well, my problem is this. And it seems like they just go from one to another to another. We're going to get into that when we get into creation evolution. It's amazing how, especially when you get into evolutionary theory, how much of evolutionary theory of 50 years ago is disproven and even rejected. But you don't have evolutionists saying, well, maybe we were wrong. They're saying, we know that we were right, so therefore we need to come up with a new theory. Because you start with this presumption, and the thing is that they keep doubling down, because the fact is what you really want to do is reject God's authority, and I'm just trying to find intellectual cover to allow me to do that. Now, does that mean that we ignore the intellectual? No, because again, we've got to recognize we need to engage the mind in order to address and remove hindrances. Now, sometimes it is really an intellectual problem, but sometimes it's, a lot of times it's kind of like, okay, I need to remove the ground for you to hide behind. And so if I ignore that, basically it's like, well, I can throw these things and it gives me good cover. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Because what we're going to find is that, that oftentimes it removes the cover. But again, the goal isn't the argument. The goal is to say, as we do that, we recognize that we're trying to remove the intellectual cover, but I'm not trying to win the argument. I'm trying to win the heart. And so if you want to really know even what that picture looks like, then you go to the example of Jesus. And so, that's the best example. And I love John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, the glory of the one only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. That He was full of grace and full of truth at the same time. That's the challenge. And again, I think with churches, we tend to be one side or another. And what I love about Jesus in the description, it doesn't say that He had both grace and truth, or that He balanced grace and truth. It's that He was full of grace and truth. That He never compromised in saying the truth, but yet He never did it in an ungracious way. And so here you see Jesus that spoke the truth, but in a way that was actually attractive to the outcasts of society, those that, the sinners and the rejected. And so that's the challenge that what we have is to be able to say, how do we do that? And that's part of what we're going to try to look at, kind of introductory throughout this whole series, but specifically dive a little deeper in this evening. So, and I'm going to pause every once in a while and give you a chance to make a comment or question if you. All right, let's keep going. Now, what this means, though, is that it starts by saying, as we do this, we need to know the truth. And so it's vital for us to recognize in this challenge, we're truth and grace, but we've got to know, if we don't know the truth, we need to know the truth so that we're ready to explain it. And so that's point 2 in the notes. Knowing the truth so that we're ready to explain it. 1 Peter 3:15, we read a minute ago, if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Now, again, that means that he's saying we need to know the truth. It doesn't mean we know it perfectly. It doesn't mean that we know every question, but that we become more and more comfortable with it. One of the things that even, I hope you realize is that as you know it, and then as sometimes you get in a discussion with somebody that's a skeptic, that's also one of the advantages of having a church and a pastor, that I get calls not infrequently of saying, well, I'm trying to witness this person. They asked this. What do I, here, let me give you a good book. Let me walk you through that question. As you step into the front lines of interacting with people, also recognize that, that you got support. And that's my job as a pastor, is to be kind of, back line support for you. And so hopefully it gives you a little bit more courage. But we've got to interact with each one ourselves. Now, some people will argue in that, well, you can't know the truth. And that's a common argument. That's actually something we're going to come back to next week. This idea, can we know the truth? Can we know religious truth? But the second argument that we're going to touch on more today is this idea that, Christianity is this blind faith that goes against reason. And and people will often say that, well, you've got to have faith, and you've got to know the truth. Well, Christianity, it's just faith. And faith is this leap into the dark. And we're going to see that's not at all the case. The Bible's actually incredibly intentional about presenting itself as a reasonable faith. And when I say reasonable, what that means is that it means it's totally in line with logic and reason. And again, the big assumption in our culture is that Christianity, that religious faith as a whole, is opposed to faith and is opposed to reason. That faith is over here and reason is over here, and that faith means that you just close your eyes and you take this blind leap into the dark. And people perceive that as faith being. Now, again, I'm going to refer to a movie. Movie scene. Some of you that have known me for a while that know I like to show movie clips. We're finding that with some of the online streaming, I don't get to do that as much. Because if I stream something and I show a movie clip, then we're broadcasting it, and that becomes a problem. And so now I have to describe it. I can't show it to you. It's interesting. I'm going to tell you the first half of this. One of my favorite, if you look at it and you say if they've got 3 or 4 movie clips that are my favorite all-time illustrations. One of them is from the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade movie. And that's the one with Sean Connery, if you all remember, where he goes to find the Holy Grail. And again, I wouldn't say that, that those movies are in any way rooted in any scriptural truth, but there's a really interesting illustration at the end. And near the end, Sean Connery or Indiana Jones is trying to get to the Holy Grail, and he has these 3 great tests that he has to pass. And then the last test is the leap of faith. And so he comes in this leap of faith, and he comes here, and there's this giant chasm. And there's nothing. It's maybe 30 yards to the other side, and there's nothing there. And he just said, what's the leap of faith? And he has these drawings of these people walking on air. And the whole idea of the leap of faith is you say, okay, does he have this leap of faith? And he closes his eyes, and he steps out into this nothingness, and there's something to hold him up. And that's the perception of what the leap of faith is, the idea of what biblical faith or what religious faith is. And people see that as being, boy, that was an expression of his faith, his expression of his belief in something that went against evidence. And that is a really commonly perceived perception of what faith is. But what we've got to realize is that when we come to faith, faith is something that is true and something that we can know. And so the real question is, what is the link between, a relationship between faith and reason? So the point A, can we know the truth? And what's that relationship between faith and reason? And the answer is, when we talk about faith, and I'm going to talk about biblical faith. Now, some people might have their own definition of religious faith and what that means, and I can't explain what every religion thinks about what faith is. All I can say is the way that the Bible talks about faith, what God means when he talks about faith. Biblical faith is a faith that is consistent with reason. But it also is faith because it goes beyond reason. And we're going to see this idea played out. I'm going to introduce it, but this is going to be an enormous theme in everything that we're going to talk about over the course of the next couple months. It's a faith that is totally consistent with reason, but it also goes beyond reason. It's something that should be consistent with what we know, with what we can test, with the evidence we can be aware of. But the fact is that it's going to also include things that we don't know. Now, if you think about that, now if we talk about not just matters of religion or even the Bible, if we just talk about faith in general, the fact is, we understand that there's a lot of things that we do that use this kind of faith. Let's take for an example. How many of you ever flown on an airplane? Okay, is there faith involved in flying on an airplane? Yeah. Now, part of that is when you go out on the airplane, I don't know the pilot. There's a lot of physics in that I don't really understand that much. There's a lot of, if you try to ask me to explain everything in it and why a plane flies, I won't do it, very well. But the fact of the matter is that there's reason that I have confidence to be able to act on something that I don't fully understand. And so it's something that it's based on reason. The fact that I know airplanes fly, I've seen that, these are airlines, that they fly these airlines all the time. There's certain things, there's evidence that I have that causes me, I trust the airline and whoever they hired as a pilot, that it's actually somebody that knows how to fly. And so there's evidence that I have, and that evidence that I have allows me to act in a way that's consistent with reason. But at the same point, there's definitely a leap of faith that goes beyond reason, beyond what I know. And that doesn't mean, I don't know about you, but most of the time I fly, I'm a little nervous. There's still something that, because it's something that I don't fully understand and it's something that's a little unnatural, you get a little nervous about it. But the fact is that I take this leap of faith where I just not only intellectually, now I have a sister that she went for, like 15 years, she wouldn't fly anywhere. Now, intellectually, you could talk to her and you could talk about air flight, it's safer to fly than it is to drive, and we could have done all that, but the fact she knew it, but she didn't believe it. And she wasn't willing to take that leap of faith. Let's take another example. I've got a couple chairs up here. And now I could get somebody to come up here and act this out for me, but the thing is that if you look at this chair, the fact is that sitting on a chair is always an act of some faith. And are you willing to come up and just plop on this chair? Just sit there and just say, I'm not going to test it, I'm just going to see it, I'm willing to have that faith. Now, the fact of the matter is that I hadn't sat on this chair before. I didn't test it, there were certain things that I looked at it and I said, faith. I have another chair here. How many of you are willing to just do the same thing on this chair? Just sit down. I'm not going to do it because the thing is that here's another chair, and the fact of the matter is that something told you that there were certain things that you could see, certain reason that said that it was consistent with reason, that I can have the leap of faith of putting my weight onto this chair, and something told you that you could see that was consistent with reason, that told you, I'm not going to have the act of faith of putting my weight onto this chair. Now, I think that's probably a wise decision if you don't. I put the chair together. It's not very well put together. The thing is that reason tells me, okay, these are cardboard blocks. They are not put that together. From what I can see. Now, it could be that it appears really, really weak and unstable, and it could be that it's really strong. It could be that the truth of it goes against reason. Now, it's really unlikely. And I could look at this one and I could say, because I didn't test it out, I didn't check, and it could be that it isn't glued together, or somebody sawed a leg off, all that's possible. Is it possible that I could sit there and I could put my faith in something that doesn't deserve that, that faith and trust, and that, suddenly this thing falls? Yeah, that's definitely possible. But the thing is that I do it based on the idea that saying, from what I can see, from what I can observe, my reason tells me that I have every reason to believe that this is stable, and my reason tells me that I have every reason to believe this isn't stable. And so therefore, both of them, you're going to make a statement of faith and say, I'm going to choose to put my faith in this, put my weight in this. I'm going to choose to not only think something, but put my action, and I'm going to choose not to put faith on this because it seems inconsistent with reason. Now, when we look at this, some people will say that, we're going to get into this next week, that this idea that religious truth is different than other truth, and it has different rules. But in reality, we're going to see next week, it's all truth. It's all the same rules. But not only that, but when you look at this whole issue of faith, when you think about an airplane, when you think about a chair, and there's so many things that you could look at, the fact is we all exercise faith every day. And we all exercise faith that is an expression towards reason, that is consistent with reason, but that goes beyond reason, that goes beyond what we can test and prove and what we can know with certainty. Now, that's not only true when it comes to practical things like chairs and cars and airplanes, but it's also true in every belief that we have. And that's the first subpoint there is that everyone, even atheists, have beliefs that require faith. And this is this dirty little secret for those who reject Christianity, especially atheists and materialists, and they never want to admit it, but they have beliefs that require faith. Now, what they try to argue is that, no, well, we have science. And again, we're going to come back to this later on. This is science, this is evidence, and you have religion, which is non-provable. But in reality, the thing is that because all truth is truth, if I make a religious statement, it also reaches into science, and I should be able to test it across the board of all those things. And if they have a scientific statement, it's making a statement about science and religion. And so not only that, so then I should be able to test. We're going to do this when we get into science and creation. We can test an atheist view and say, is that more consistent or less consistent with the truth that we have? And the fact is that you have a belief, and you can test it, and we can see, okay, is it this kind of chair or is this kind of chair? And the fact of the matter is that both views are based on evidence. Both of them require a leap of faith. The only question is, which one is more consistent with the evidence that we have? Both of them are going to require a leap of faith. And so we've got to realize, though, that as we go into this, and this should be true for both parties, all of us, as I come into the discussion, I come in with a bias. I come in with a bias that starts with the assumption that Christianity is true. I will admit that. Now, there are some people that are, that even will write a book now, and they'll start and say, well, I started with the other bias, and I was won over. But we should all admit, even as Christians, I should admit that I start with the bias. We all do. But the problem is the other side, the atheists, they won't admit that there's a bias. Oh, no, we're totally objective, and really, no, you're not. You start with a bias. We should all do that. And then we should look at both sides and say, okay, if both things are possible, then which side is more consistent with what we can know and prove? Let's go and test the chairs. Let's just don't go just sit and put your whole future and soul into this chair. Test them. Go check out the legs. See which one, and when you start to shake it, if this one falls over, then don't put your whole future, your eternal future into this thing that doesn't stand. We got to test it. We've got to be able to say which one stands more with reason, which one is more consistent with what we can evidence we can prove. What we're really saying is which one requires blind faith and which one requires a faith that is consistent with reason. See, because that's the second point. Faith should always be consistent with reason. It doesn't go against reason. It is consistent with reason. When I'm talking about, again, now some people will talk about religious faith and what they mean as a blind faith. And I'm talking about biblical faith, what the Bible talks about faith, and what I believe is the only kind of faith that we should have. It's the only kind of faith you should have when you're flying an airplane or sitting in a chair or dealing with your eternal destiny. It should be a faith that is consistent with reason, a faith that is talking about truth, and where there's truth that we can test, we should test it. And what is truth? Well, truth is reality, and so it should be truth that conforms to reality. It's a description of what's real. And so when we talked about, beforehand, this idea that, that many people view faith as this idea of it's this leap into the dark. It's not. Biblical faith is not a leap into the dark. Biblical faith is a step into the light. That's another subpoint there. Faith should be a step into the light, not a leap into the dark. And that's any kind of faith. And what I really believe is that what's going to happen is that in this study, we're going to find that anyone who looks honestly and openly is willing to consider all sides of the equation, and they look open and honestly at this issue, you're going to find that it actually, takes. There's one of the books that we'll recommend is that there's a book called I Don't Have Faith to Be an Atheist. And the whole idea is to say, if you look at this, it takes way more faith to be an atheist than to be a Christian. Because as a Christian, I'm testing it out and I'm saying this thing's really solid. And there's a leap of faith, but it's a leap of faith that is pretty small because it's totally consistent with logic and reason. From the atheist, you're shaking it and the whole thing's falling down. And your leap of faith is enormous. It's one thing to get on an airplane, go to Cleveland Municipal, and you've got the, Boeing, 767, and getting on that. It's another thing to go there, and you got this airplane, and they've got, these propellers with rubber bands going, and they're saying this is going to fly you to Chicago. I'm not getting on that plane because it's not consistent with what I know. And that's what I think that you have happening. Now let's go back to that illustration that I used earlier, Indiana Jones. And guess what I love about the illustration is the whole illustration was it was these three great tests, and the last one was this leap of faith, and so there's this great chasm, and there's nothing between him and the other side, 30 yards, and so he closes his eyes and he steps out blindly, and there's this invisible beam, and he walks across, seeming nothing, and that's supposed to be the leap of faith. But I think the best illustration is what happens at the very end of that. It was really funny. I used this on a Sunday morning back a number of years ago, and I gave it to our tech guy at the time. Wasn't Danny, it was Bob Watkins, and I said, okay, do this. And then he cut this very last part off the scene because he didn't think it belonged. And I said, that's the whole thing. That's the whole point. Because what happens is he gets to the other side, and then he scoops up this dirt, and he throws it out. And you see this dirt and these rocks go out on this invisible beam, and you see the outline of this invisible beam. And I said, that's what faith is. That's what biblical faith is we're taking rocks and we're taking dirt and we're throwing it out there and we're saying, does it hold up? Do you see the outline of truth? I can't prove without evidence that that there is a God. I can't go back and historically show you a movie of Jesus being Jesus walking out of the tomb. There's certain things that we can't do that. But the fact is that I can throw the rocks out there and say, this is the evidence we can prove, and it's consistent with this. And meanwhile, I can throw these other ones out and say, it's all drop into the ground. And if it's drop into the ground, then it really is stupid to close your eyes and step out there. You can do that. You can have that blind faith, but chances are you're going to fall to the ground. See, what we're doing is we're talking about this kind of faith where we're testing it this way. We're having this really seeking truth. Now, then the question we might say, well, then how do we know the truth? That's point B there. How should we evaluate the truthfulness of our faith? How do we know? How do we find the evidence? And here's where, again, we have to come back to it. We're going to look at all the different issues that we're talking about, science, and we're talking about history, and we're talking about the Bible, and we're talking about morality, and we're talking about all these different things that we're going to look at. And so there's not like this single thing that you say, okay, this is going to be the proof here. But what I want you to realize is that when we even ask that question, how do we know the truth? The standard for how we look at and evaluate the truth for the Bible should be similar to the standard that we use to evaluate any other truth. And by that, what I mean is, it could be higher, but the thing is, it shouldn't be radically different. And here's the problem, is that a lot of times skeptics come and they say, here's the standard, and the standard is not anywhere close to what they would use for anything else. And so they would say, the Bible is this, and the Bible, well, here's this one part, and I don't understand this one thing. Okay, so does that mean that every other, that you read some history that, and if you didn't understand one point, or it seemed like one fact was out, you're going to throw the whole book out? When you really have that standard? Or people will, for example, when you get into the whole science and evolution, they'll talk about how Copernicus thought that the Earth was the center of the universe because it talks about the sunrise. And, well, you know what? If I hear you say that what time's the sunrise, I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, you're an Earth-centered person. You deny the whole, the whole view of the universe. You think the Earth is the center of the. No, I'm going to say that you're using a commonly used phrase, the sunrise. You're not trying to make a scientific statement, but yet you have people arguing against the authority of the Bible based on rejecting it because it said there's a sunrise. And that kind of stuff happens. Or you think about history. Can we prove that Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth? Prove it to me. Take me back in time and show me it happening. No, you can't do that if that's the standard. But what we can do is that there are certain historical standards that we look at and we say, well, how do we evaluate that claim? Let's look at other resources. Let's look at, contemporary. There's a lot of things that we look at, and we can say with great evidence, okay, we know that John Wilkes Booth, shot Abraham Lincoln. We know that Julius Caesar was killed on the Ides of March. There's a lot of things in history that you can't prove, but the evidence is sure there. And so we hold it with a high degree of standard. Now, what if we hold the Bible beyond the same way? But that's the problem, is that people that attack the Bible don't hold the same standard. They have this impossible standard to say, if I have any question about anything at any time, or if anything sounds a little bit out, well, I can throw the whole thing out. Well, you didn't. That just, that's not intellectually honest. Can I say that even in this time that we're going to be able to answer every question that is ever going to be asked by every skeptic? No. The fact is that, again, if you're a skeptic, number one, you're going to always find problems and questions, and number two, there's a point where you go back and you say, while Christian faith is consistent with reason, it goes beyond reason, there's going to be things that still require faith. So what's the standard? Well, let's even use the standard we talk about in American culture, evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. We use that standard everywhere else. Why don't we use that standard when it comes to this whole question of Christianity? There will be still a place of faith. There still is a place where you need to sit down and put your weight on this, where you need to get on the plane, where you're not going to understand everything. But the fact is it should be a leap of faith that's consistent with reason, that is consistent with the same systems that we use of thinking through and evaluating other truth in other contexts. Now, again, I'm going to mention a resource here that I'll come back to. A great example of that is that there's a book written by J. Warner Wallace, who was a police detective, and his book is Cold Case Christianity. And basically, what he does is there's a guy that was a police detective for a long time, and he just said, okay, let me look. Actually, he started out as a skeptic. And he started to look at Christianity, and as a skeptic, he used the same logic that he would as a police detective. As a police detective, can you prove without any doubt that that this crime happened? No, evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And there are certain laws of logic, and there are certain laws of evidence. And what if we did that same logic and evidence towards Christianity? And what he found is there's incredible evidence for the truthfulness of Christianity. And it caused him to believe. So we're going to see that as we go throughout. That's kind of like the idea. So any comments or questions? Yep, Don.
I think something I just heard recently, it's a good illustration, is that difference between the scientific method and the evidentiary method.
Yes.
Physical science, we will observe, experiment, prove. The evidentiary method is the preponderance of reasonable evidence.
That's a good point. And for those that are online, he's talked about there's a difference between scientific method and evidentiary method. And there's a scientific method of, we can test and we can prove. And again, there's very few things that we can test with scientific method. Historical, anything that, and again, there's a lot of science we can do with creation and evolution, but we can't go back and redo creation. And so there's a lot of things that we can't, if you hold to that scientific method, the fact is there's no other history that you use by that method. There's very few other things that, again, you've got to be consistent with, judge Christianity by the same standard as you judge whatever you believe. And again, I think when we do that honestly, and there's a lot of dishonesty in some of these discussions, and again, sometimes as Christians, we hear that dishonesty and we don't know how to act. It's like, oh, they asked this question, I don't know how. Well, it's actually a pretty simple answer. But part of that is that they're changing the rules. Christianity is this set of rules that's impossible to meet versus theirs that we just, well, this is what I believe without any evidence. That's a good point. Thank you. So, all right. So, this next point in the notes, point 3. We have a question online. How do you answer the question, why did God put something on earth that we could choose instead of him? And that's a great question, and that's one of the things that people will really get into, this idea of free will. And we're going to come into some of this when we get into morality. And I do believe that there's a sense that God created us as free will beings. And a lot of that is we're created in his image. And so that, it's not only that he didn't want to create robots, and people talk about that, but if we're created in his image, that means that as image bearers of God, that God has a free will, and so we likewise have a free will. But in that free will, what we've got to realize is God gives us the freedom to choose him or to reject him. And it's not only choosing other things, it's really choosing ourselves as our own authority. So when you think about any rejection of God, it's really rejection of his authority. And that's what you see with Adam and Eve. That's what you see with eating the apple. I think I know better than God. And so there's exactly why did he do that? I don't fully understand God's mind. I won't understand that whole. But I think more than anything else, that if he created us in his image, he created us with a free will because he has a free will. And with that free will, we had the freedom to choose to, good and evil, to choose to obey him or to not obey him. I know that, they continue on. The bigger question is, why does he permit evil? And I'm not going to go that deep into that because we're going to go, in fact, let me make sure I've got my date on that, because we're going to go deep into that on, let me make sure I've got the right date, March 7th. So you've got to make sure and tune in on March 7th, and I will go much deeper into that question on that day. And again, I'll tell you, there's some very good answers to that. But a lot of times, a lot of these answers, it's thinking through more broadly the question. And so it's not only why did God allow evil, but if you understand that, I'll tell you, give you a little bit of an advertisement for March 7th, all right? That question, which people give as an evidence against God, the question itself is an evidence for God. And we'll get into that week. But what you'll see is the very fact that you're asking that question actually proves God. And so if I've got you lost, hopefully I just got you lost and curious at the same time. So come back on March 7th. All right, so what do? God calls us to reach the mind with truth and the heart with grace. Now, part of that is that, and this is where I mentioned the book beforehand, Tactics. Again, really good book about apologetics, and these are some of the ideas that he develops in that book. And so again, I'm going to recommend that as a really good book. One of the things that he talks a lot about, which I think is very biblical, is the need to rediscover the agricultural picture of evangelism. And so that's point 3A, rediscovering the agricultural picture of evangelism. The most common illustration that Jesus uses for the process of talking to people about faith is the illustration of agriculture, of planting and of tending and of harvesting. Now, if you think in terms of agriculture, if you remember and realize that when God tells us, okay, here's how you do this, and he explains what this should look like, and he uses agriculture as the image, then there's a rule that we have to remember. And the rule is, before there can be any harvest, there must always be a season of planting and a season of gardening. And you think about this, Jesus himself talked about this, that there are seasons of sowing, and there are seasons of gardening and tending that always precede seasons of reaping. Now, this is something that we understand is always true in agriculture, but we also have to understand that it's just as true when it comes about talking about our faith, about apologetics or about evangelism. Before anyone comes to Christ, there's always a season of planting and of gardening. There's a season where they're hearing the truth, and there's a season where they're thinking it over. Francis Schaeffer, when he talked about this, he talked about pre-evangelism. And I think that was interesting in that description, but I think that's probably a bad description because I don't think it is pre-evangelism. I think it's evangelism. I think the problem is that we have defined evangelism wrongly, and it's really hurt a lot of our witnessing. I think the next point, most people think of most of evangelism as planting and gardening, not harvesting. Most evangelism is planting and gardening, not harvesting. Now, let me ask you a question. I'm going to make it interactive here for a moment. You got to talk, and I'm going to repeat what you say. We talk about evangelists. If you, in your mind, you can think of, when you say a great evangelist, right? If you could think of someone who is a great evangelist that what God would use, what traits do you think of that evangelist? Let me ask you just to throw some out there. What's a trait of a great evangelist? Billy Graham, okay. That's a person. What are some of the traits? When you think about what defines them, when you think he's like this or he's good speaker, charismatic. He kept the message simple, but stayed on message. Truthful. All right. Any others? Traits of great evangelist. You can be online. You could jump in here too if you want. Persistent. Okay, good. Knowledgeable.
How about willing?
Willing. Okay, good. Passionate. Faithful. And what else? Live the life. Okay, good. Now let me ask you another question. Think of the person or people that have been most influential in leading you to faith in Christ. What are their traits? Patient. Loving. Genuine. Okay. Anybody else? Not being forceful. Okay. Yeah, wisdom, practical wisdom. Joyful, peaceful. You know what's amazing? Somebody put in caring. You know what's amazing is that pretty much everybody said similar things about the people that were most involved in leading them to Christ. I could ask the question pretty much knowing what answers I would get. And it's amazing how different it is from the description of what we think is a great evangelist. Now, here's what's really amazing about that is that I think the great evangelists would be the kind of people that would be most responsible for leading the most of the people. And, if we take a bunch of Christians and say most of the people are led by someone like this, that's the great evangelist. But why is it that when we think of the great evangelist, we think of somebody radically different than the people that led us to Christ? You ever thought about that? It's a pretty significant question. See, when we think of great evangelists, we think of not only the Billy Graham or the people that go out witnessing and the people that are, and we think of that kind of person. And the problem is when we think of that kind of person, we think, I'm not like them. I can't do that. That's not who I am. But then when we think about the person who was responsible leading us to Christ, most of us think, I can be like that. I can be patient. I can be, it's not knowledge, it's wisdom, it's being caring, it's being loving, it's being all those things. And we can be like that. But what you realize is the great evangelists are the people that are leading people to Christ. And the vast majority of people are being led to Christ are people being led by the caring, loving, patient, gracious relationship, those kind of people. Now, when you think of that in these terms, most of what those people did were planting and gardening, not harvesting. Most of what they did is when we talked about they weren't, they were patient. They weren't pushing and they weren't forcing. They weren't trying to, to pull you out of the ground in a sense. They were saying, okay, how do we nurture? How do we feed? How do we love? How do we, they were planting the truth, just speaking the truth, but in a gracious way. They were gardening, but they weren't the harvesters.
We do the planting, God does the water.
That's exactly the next point in the thing. It says, in gardening, only God can cause a growth. And that's one of the things that we realize, is that why are these the most effective evangelists? Because they're out there, they're doing the planting, and they're doing, the gardening, and we realize that I do my part, but God does the miracle. See, that's true in gardening. We understand that. I can't make something grow. I don't really understand it. I just know that, you plant something, and man, it's amazing what can come up from what you plant. And the same principle should be true when we share our faith, when we talk about our faith, when we engage even with skeptics. That it's our job to not think agriculturally. We're not primarily, most evangelists are not harvesters. Most of them are planters and gardeners. That's the vast majority of what evangelism is about.
That's why I like the parable of the sower who's just throwing out seed everywhere, some land on rock, and someone might say, oh, it'll never grow there, why you waste my time? He's throwing it out on the rock, the weeds, every place. And, I know it won't grow if you don't plant the seed, so you plant the seed everywhere, see where it takes root.
Yeah, and for those online, he's saying that's what he loves about the parable of the sower. And, just that, it's that agricultural picture, and it is. That's the number one thing. Now, point B in the notes for those that are using this, evangelism is usually a long-time process, not an event. Now, here's one of the things that happens and what makes this difficult. Back in primarily the 1950s, 1960s, there were a number of church leaders in the church that developed some well-known evangelism programs. Probably the best examples would be Campus Crusade and the Four Spiritual Laws and Evangelism Explosion, James Kennedy. And in this time, you had evangelistic tracts became very popular. And many of these programs taught people to go out and present the gospel in 15 minutes. So again, I remember in college being with Campus Crusade and being taught to do that. And I was literally Evangelism Explosion. That was Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. That's where I was ordained at that church. That was where my exam was, and so I was very familiar with that program. I was actually, pursued and heading that program up at that church. So I know it very, very well. And it was, there was good parts to it, but it was presented as this 15-minute presentation ended by calling people to make a decision. And what happened is that many people started to believe that that was normative of what evangelism was. Even so much so that, you say, well, here's the evangelism ministry. We're going to go out and we're going to go witness to these strangers that we don't know. Now, here's what you've got to realize. First of all, at no point in history has that ever been the primary means by which God brings people to saving faith. And that's, again, evidenced by this room. When we talk about who was, the evangelists we were thinking of were those kind of people, and none of us were led to Christ by those kind of people. And there are numerous studies that show that the vast majority of people are led to Christ by people that they know, that they have a relationship with over an extended period of time. Very few people are led to Christ by a preaching evangelist like Billy Graham or by a stranger. Are there a few? There are a few, but very, very few. And so that's not the normative. And the problem is when we think it's the normative, then we think that's what we should be doing. So, Andrew. Now, if it's a long one, I'm going to ask you to come up here so people can hear. Yeah. Well, the question is, what's the distinction between evangelism and discipleship? And that's a great question. And let me go to the Great Commission. And the Great Commission is, what is the Great Commission? Go make disciples. And the one call that you have is to make disciples, and that includes evangelism and teaching them to obey. All right? Now I'm going to go out of my notes here. All right? So I'm going to... in fact, it's just a little bit down. It's evangelism. You're closer to kind of anticipating where I was going with this, all right? Let me talk about a spiritual continuum, all right? Now, one of the problems with the EE and things like that, at the time it made it more effective because we lived in a primarily Christianized culture that believed in God, that believed in biblical morality, that believed in biblical truth. And so you could start with like 4 spiritual laws. God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. I could say that on a college campus back when I was in college, back in the 80s, all right? And it worked. If I go to a college campus now and say that, it doesn't work at all. God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. I don't believe that there's a God, and if there's a God, I don't believe he's wonderful and I don't like him. There's nothing about that statement that is assumed to be true, that was assumed to be true not that long ago. Now, let me take this idea of a spiritual continuum. All right, let's go from a standpoint, I'm going to just take -10 to +10. So you have somebody that's -10, hopefully in the camera, Danny, -10, total atheist, opposed to God, opposed to everything. Okay, you have somebody that's there. And you have somebody that's, -8, and they may be an atheist, and they're negative, but they're not maybe as hostile, and 5 that they're, live without any thought for God, but there might be some openness, and then you get to a -3, and a lot of the thing is if you look back in the 1950s, 1960s, most of the culture was like -1, 2, or 3. They believed in God, they believed in biblical morality. The question was, okay, are they going to accept him? Now, and then beyond that, you say, okay, conversion is at 0. That's when you actually trust Christ as your Lord and Savior. And then you start your spiritual growth from, a new believer, 1 to somebody who's totally sold out to 10. All right, now let's go back to the Great Commission. The Great Commission is to make disciples. And when it says make disciples of all nations, it's saying doing everything that it goes on this side of the continuum and everything it takes from this side of the continuum. So that means if I'm interacting with somebody that's a -7, I try to meet them and interact with them, not necessarily to get them converted at that moment, but to move them a little further towards Christ. If I have an interaction with somebody and I can get them from a -7 to a -6, that's a huge success. If I'm interacting with somebody and I can move them from a new believer and move them from a 1 to a 2, that's a huge success. Now, there's a handful of people that God might call me to be involved in long term where I'm really invested in them and I may be helping walk them from here down that line or up the line of growth. But the fact is, God calls all of us to look for those opportunities to interact with people and to say, if I have that chance to be able to speak truth or be involved in a small way and help move them from where they're at a little bit further, that's great. That's what the church should be doing. And the fact of the matter is it's not only in that, but a lot of times evangelism should be a team approach. You know, that I might be sitting there building this relationship with this person and going this far, and there might be somebody else that comes in, and that because they relate, you know, because they have a similar experience, or becomes, you know, they suddenly are able to move that person further than I could. And I got them this far, but God brought that other person in this point because they add something unique. That's the body of Christ. You know, I shouldn't think that I'm the sole disciple, or the more effective evangelism, discipleship, all that, the more people I get people exposed to, the better God's using his body to accomplish that. But if I understand this whole idea of the spiritual continuum, see, the old idea of seeing it as an event is that I go out and I present the gospel and I say, are you ready to receive Christ now? And I want to pray the prayer, and if you don't pray the prayer, I failed. And the whole idea of spiritual continuum is that that's not true. Is that in the spiritual continuum is the idea of agriculture. You know, if I planted the seed, that's successful. If I watered the seed, that's successful. If I have a little part of it, that's successful. If I move somebody a little further down the road, that's successful. And it's part of this whole bigger picture of what God's doing. And so, and I don't have to be the primary person involved in people's lives. God may just drop me in somebody's life in such a way that I have this interaction with, and I don't even know the interaction. I don't know what's coming before and after. But if I'm just faithful there, God could take this little thing that I do here and suddenly use it in ways that and I see that sometimes. I'll see people that will come into church, and you know, I remember somebody, I was talking to somebody that's going into medicine about this, and even we had somebody come into our church back a number of years ago, and it's like, well, what happened? Well, you know, we're having heart problems, and I go to my heart doctor, and they asked me before, you know, they said, well, you know, before meetings, I always offer to pray with patients. Is that okay with you? And they're like, yeah, it's okay, you know. But that just opened up the being fearful about their heart, and this doctor praying with them got them saying, we need to go to church. Now the doctor never knew that. He never knew. He just did his little part. He never knew that he had moved them, you know, a little further down the continuum, and then handed them off to someone else who, you know, that he planted the seed and watered it, and then someone else, and he never got to be there for part of the harvest. But in heaven, he's going to know that. And I really hope that in heaven I get to be a part of a lot of stories, but most of the stories I'll probably never know about. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question somewhat? I think it's exciting. I think that's exciting from a standpoint of how many people that we get to be involved in, and also to recognize that success is much more broad than I ever dreamed. That if I have a chance just to be in that garden for a little while and tend this plant and to give a little bit of water, if God uses me to move someone from a -8 to a -7, or from a -4 to a -3, and I'm part of that chain, man, praise God. But that's also encouraging. Because what I sense is when you think of an event, you know, people go out, I did this, and they weren't, you know, I come back and I said, I got to share my faith, and there might be times they even responded to what we're going to get into this. You know, sometimes they'll respond negatively. The negativeness isn't necessarily rejection. Sometimes the negativeness is you poke something sensitive there, and God's getting into the heart, and so they respond negatively, and I don't have to get discouraged by that. I can be encouraged by the fact that God gave me this chance, and I really look forward to seeing all the seeds that I'm planting and plants that I'm watering. I'm looking forward to seeing in heaven how many of those things actually bore fruit. It's a totally different perspective. So it's all consistent. Let me give you a scripture that I think it's consistent with as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul says this, I planted, Apollo watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, only God who gives the growth. And this whole picture of what it means, this agricultural picture, that that it's not just an event, it's, you know, this process that we're, you know, that if we're doing the planting, if we're doing the watering, if we're doing the gardening, that's all part of the value. And then we're sensitive to the point where, you know, sometimes you're there and the fruit's just ready to fall off the tree, and if you get to be there and you get to be the harvest, praise God, that's joyful. But the thing is that you don't have to be the guy that picked off the fruit to be a part of the process. Good. Any other comments or questions? I hope this is encouraging. And even as we deal with skeptics and we talk about people that seem so closed, and somebody could really seem hostile, really, your goal isn't to get them to, your goal isn't to win the argument or get them to pray the prayer tomorrow. That's not the goal. The goal is if I can interact in such a way that I move them if I can get them from a -10 to a -9, that's really good. And then whether God keeps me in their life so that I continue to move them down, or whether God brings somebody else in their life, then I'm going to say, God, just help me to be faithful with the part that you've given me. And I know some of you think about people, in your family and things like that, where you say, I did this, and then God brought this person in, and it's just amazing how God does that work. So now let me wrap up, and we got like 10 minutes to go, and give you some ideas here about speaking to the mind while focusing on the heart. Now there's going to be some more this week probably than many, because it's a lot about, again, I think this tactics book and some of these ideas, it's really not only, kind of speaking the truth, but how we do it. Let me just give you a couple principles to remember, and then a couple strategies. Okay, principle number 1 to remember, that our mission is needed. People are lost without it. Now lost people don't necessarily know they're lost, but the fact that they don't know they're lost doesn't make them less lost. And if they, that it doesn't mean that we need to pursue them. You think of it this way: if you have a child that's lived in the whole street, their whole life as an orphan on the street, that's all they've ever known. They've never known what it's meant to be adopted or part of a family. They don't know they're lost. And they might even resist the idea of adoption at first because they don't know what they're missing. And they may see it as a threat. You're taking them away from what they've known. And they don't even understand what they could possibly gain. And, or even in that, there's times that it means that we should take the risk of speaking truth in such a way that might cause a little tension. Because again, let's think in terms of eternity. Because I do believe there's an eternity, there's a heaven and hell. If you coming home one evening, it's 10 o'clock at night, you look inside your neighbor's door and you see fire. And all their lights are out, but you see fire that is going on in their kitchen. You don't go knock on the door. Oh, they didn't answer. They might have gone to sleep already. I don't want to wake them up. No, there's a need. You go pound on the door. You go, they might be mad that you wake them up. Who's pounding on the door? Until they realize that there's a fire. And again, when we realize that, we say that, you say, well, their life is on the line. Yeah, that's the whole idea. Their soul's on the line. And so we need to be willing to take the risk based on love. That when we realize that we also need to realize that it's a war, not a battle. And so we need to be willing to persevere. And I love a couple of people talked about how the people led you to Christ. They persevered. They were patient. They were, they loved us. And so likewise realize if somebody doesn't positively respond right away, don't get discouraged. Don't reject the relationship. We need to realize that we build this relationship. We persevere. We're trying to love them into the faith. Remember that it's God uses our willingness. But he works by his power. That, I love, a couple weeks ago, we used the illustration for those that were here about, what if their hearts are, solid and they're rock, and here we just have this little tiny seed, and, we had these pictures of a tree growing through a rock and splitting this rock in half. And you look at this, and the seed can't do that. Well, but what God does through growth is like that. And again, this is the encouragement. If you look at their ability to believe, you'll get discouraged. If you look at your ability to convince them, you'll get discouraged. If you believe in God's ability to change them, you'll be really encouraged. And if you really want encouragement, and again, I don't have a lot of time to spend on this, but I'm just going to throw out real quickly, the biggest encouragement is this. Theologically, I believe a lot of what prayer is God giving us the chance to participate in what he seeks to do. And so in my experience, the more people I pray for, the more people come to know Christ. And what I find is that if he lays it on my heart to pray for people that are really, really closed, that's kind of fun to get to do, because I've gotten to see some really, really unlikely people come to know Christ, and what a joy that is. But persevere through that, recognizing that we have hope because of him. and you say, well, I don't know what to say. Well, I'm glad you're here. That's helpful. But you know what? Even if you're not here, that's still okay for those that are online. I don't know what to say. Think about this. You know who the most effective evangelists are? New Christians who don't know anything. They're by far the most effective evangelists. Now, we're going to come back to that in just a moment, too. But part of that is it's not only relationships, but you know what? They don't know anything. They just know, Christ changed my life. I'm excited about him. And come and, the woman in Samaria, come and see this person that has told me everything. And so, if that's true, you know more than that new believer who's a really effective evangelist. So you know enough. Give you a couple tactics, just practical things. Number one, build relationships. Again, one of the, there was a book that was out a while ago, and it talked especially about Gen Xers and millennials and why they rejected the Christianity. And one of the comments was that, one of the most common comments is that Christians don't care about me. If these were people that interacted with Christians and they said they just want converts, not friends. They don't value me as a person. We've got to build relationships. I remember having read that, and then God brought me into the life of somebody that was an atheist. His wife had become a Christian. He was without telling you a lot of his story, he was a Jewish heritage atheist. And so God just led me to build a relationship with him, and I did. And over time, now I knew where he stood, he knew where I stood, and we just mainly just spent time, and I'll tell you the one question I asked him in a minute. But we spent time together, and I just built a relationship with him. And I remember one day, probably 3 or 4 years into this friendship, him telling me something that was just floored you. He said, Mike, you're not like most Christians I know. He says, most Christians start to tell me about Jesus, and I tell them I'm not interested, and then they just tell me I'm going to hell. And then what he was saying is, not only do they just tell me I'm going to hell, but they drop me there. And what he didn't say, which I know he was saying by what he didn't say, is, you not only don't drop me, but you're my friend. And the fact is that it took me years of friendship to earn the right to share the gospel beyond what he had already heard. But the fact is that, again, here was a guy that there were some tactics. He was an atheist. We had to talk in time about the truthfulness of the gospel. There was an intellectual hurdle. But the bigger issue was his heart. And I had to win the right. I had to speak to his heart to win the right to speak to his mind. And that was just caring about him, just going out to lunch with him once every other month, and just caring about him. And he knew I did. We became friends, and that gave me the right to share the gospel. Second tactic, ask questions. The fact is that I can tell somebody the truth, and as soon as I tell them the truth, they're already thinking the argument against me. If I ask a question, the fact is I'm not only learning about them, but if I ask the right question, I'm getting them to think about the truth. If I ask a question that gets them to think about the truth, and and they've come to that truth by their own, they don't have anybody to argue with. You want to know? Look at the example of Jesus. Again, another great book, Questioning Evangelism. Really talks about this and how Jesus, that was his style. I know some of you, those that have been in CLC or BLC, we've read that book. Really good book. And it really just talks about the style of Jesus and using questions as a way of doing that. Some of that is asking questions that you drop at the question. Probably one of the best questions that I know when you really get to a skeptic and they're really just arguing against you is that I'll ask them, if I were able to prove to you without a reasonable doubt the truthfulness of Christianity, would you believe? And they want to argue that. And I said, I don't want to argue, just think about that and walk away. And I said, I'm just asking the question, if I could prove it's true, would you believe? Or is it really you're rejecting it not because it's not true, because you don't want it to be true? No, I don't want to discuss it. I want to ask the question and leave room for the Holy Spirit to convict, because he's going to do a whole lot better job of telling them the truth than I will. So ask questions. But lastly, pray. That's the last note in the notes. If it's really a matter of the heart, the most important resource is prayer. So pray. And I'm not going to not only say pray, but I think it's a great idea to tell them you're praying for them. And I think about that one atheist friend of mine. That's the only question I'd ask him. We'd go out to lunch, we'd have time, and I'd tell him, especially early on, I said, Edwin, I said, I know you don't believe in God, you don't believe in prayer, but I do. And when I think about things that I can do to serve you and to be kind, it's praying for you. And I know you don't believe in it, but I'm going to ask you to just, just kind of, let me do this. And if there's something I can pray for you about, what would it be? And the thing is that he would give me really inane answers for the first, 6 months or a year. And then next time I saw him, hey, when I've been praying for that, how's it going? And what happened is that he started to give me real questions, real prayer requests. And that's what opened up, the thing is that most people, even if they're an atheist, if you approach it that way, I just want to serve you, and I know you don't believe in this, but this is the way that because of what I believe, how can I pray for you? They can't get that mad at you for that. You're just trying to communicate love, and it opens up the door spiritually. There was another guy, I'll probably come back to this story in a couple weeks. There's another guy that is Hindu. And again, I was asking that question all the time. He almost got in an accident, his life flashed before his eyes. And again, he'd never gone that deep. And but suddenly, as soon as that does it, he's like, who's the guy that I can call? Oh, that guy that prays for me. And he called me from the road like 2 minutes after he almost got killed. Because it was like I was the guy that he had to talk to about this experience where he almost died. And you know what? We started talking. We had a friendship that had been really shallow that suddenly started to go really deep. But God, it was that friendship. It was prayer, letting him, not only I was praying for him and God was using it, but telling him I was praying for him. Just that statement, how can I pray for you? I can't tell you how many times I would do that. And it might be months, it might be years. But something happens and they have a spiritual need. And suddenly they're thinking, who can I talk to? And they think about that person that prays for them. Beyond that, I would say this. I have, in years, and we've done that some here too, we've at times in the past, and I'm going to come back and restate it every once in a while. I challenge you to say, who are 3 people that you can pray for? Think of 3 people that God puts on your heart and pray for them on a regular basis. And I'd encourage you to pray regularly. God, I pray for their salvation. Give me an opportunity to share my faith. I will tell you, I have never talked to someone who I've given that challenge to that has done it, that 2 years later can't tell me about one person that came to know Christ. It never happened. Now, what I've done is that I've done that. Most people come and say, oh, yeah, I remember that. I meant to do it. Or I forgot to pray. That's what and then every once, a couple of people say, I've been doing that. Oh, this person came to know. This person, again, we had a testimony this spring out from one of the outdoor services. All 3 of them came to know Christ. I need 3 new people. Great problem. That's awesome. And so I encourage you to pray. And recognize that, yes, we need to be involved in knowing the truth and being able to share that. But at the end of the day, it's God's going to change the heart. And part of that might be God giving us the right thing to say at the right moment, but it's going to be mainly God softening the heart and taking this heart of stone and taking a little seed and using that seed to grow and crack that heart open. And that's the kind of miracles that we get to be a part of. So, well, I've enjoyed tonight. I thank you again for those that are joining us online as well. And we look forward to next week. And again, next Sunday, we're going to be really talking more about kind of postmodern truth and how do we deal with some of the kind of the newer objections to the Christian faith, and people even coexist. How do we respond to that? All faiths are the same. How do you respond to that? Can you know truth? And so there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to be talking about, and so I look forward to that. But let me close in prayer. Father, I thank you again for the chance that we have to spend this time together this evening. I thank you for your truth. Father, I thank you for the chance that you call us to be able to engage in truth, to have a faith that isn't a leap into the dark, but Father, to have a faith that truly is a step into the light. Father, help us to be confident in our faith. Father, help us to be not only confident in the faith that we have, but to become more confident in such a way that we're able to engage people. Father, that we're able to talk with people, that we're able to go with a courage and confidence, and recognizing that it's not about winning the arguments, it's just about planting the seeds. It's not about harvesting, it's often about just planting and tending and gardening and then letting you do the miracle. And Father, help us to believe that you will do those miracles. Father, we thank you again for this time. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. God bless you. Have a good week.